Anybody know what happened in Cyprus? What's happening in Cyprus? Yeah, not that I knew, but I had dinner with Barry Eckengreen last night, so now I know. So there were a bunch of us, and it's like, I'm teaching bank runs tomorrow. Talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. So that was from Mary Poppins, and then you can also watch, of course, It's a Wonderful Life and see the bank run in It's a Wonderful Life, or you can go on YouTube or the news or whatever and check out what's going on in Cyprus, where it's not clear what's happening. But the most recent news, let's see, yesterday's news was that the EU had put pressure on Cyprus to, so this is my synopsis from my conversation with Professor Eckengreen last night, that the solution to the problem, and I forget how the problem started, was that the government of Cyprus, I know, the government of Cyprus is the Cypriot government, that the Cypriot government had to come up with $6 billion, and so their way, euros, and so their way of doing this was to place a tax on the deposits of people who have funds in the banks of Cyprus. Now, it turns out that most of the money in Cyprus comes not from the citizens of Cyprus, but from Russian oligarchs, as Barry Eckengreen said, who are laundering money. So there's a lot of money laundering that goes through Cyprus. But they couldn't come up with a plan that says, tax the Russian folks who are laundering money and leave the rest of us alone. So they came up with this first plan to tax the deposits. Well, if you're sitting here right now and I tell you, oh, by the way, they're going to reduce the balance in your checking account by 10% tomorrow in order to pay some, I don't know what it is, bill to the Germans who you don't have a whole lot of fondness for anyway, what would you do with your bank account? Empty it, yeah. And so not surprisingly, there had been the beginnings of runs on the banks in Cyprus yesterday, which is why the banks in Cyprus and the stock market in Cyprus are all closed. So one way to stop the bank is to shut the bank. So they have declared what we called in the 30s a bank holiday, so they've shut down all the banks so that no one can withdraw their funds. In the meantime, the Parliament apparently had to pass this bill that called for a tax on the balance in the checking accounts, and the Parliament today rejected it, 36-zip. So nobody voted in favor of it, which is not terribly surprising. And so it's like this old Greek drama that's unfolding. You know, it's like Sophocles wrote this years ago. So who knows what will happen next. But anyway, all sorts of fascinating things. Not on the agenda for today. On the agenda for today is the U.S. economy in the 20s and the 30s. So we still have pieces to do from last time, which is looking at the economy in the 20s and the 30s, so sort of the background to the Great Depression, and then talking about explanations of the Great Depression. Both today we hit the downturn. We'll start the severity of the Depression. And we'll probably finish up the notes from today on Thursday. It's not my expectation that I'll get through all of today's slides, and we'll finish that up on Thursday. Do y'all have any questions before we jump in? We'll go Pete first this time. Let's stand first. All right, cool. No, because I don't have anything to say. Do you want me to say? What do you want me to say? So the response, there's a response paper due Friday, that you know. And then the question that Rachel had was, do I want to talk about the term paper? Not really. The term paper is due in a month, about give or take. Make sure that you look at the grading rubric before you get started on it, so that you have a sense of what you're expected to do, because that's always your best guide to what you're expected to do. The particular question that had been raised was, were you expected to do your own primary research, so are you expected to do your own econometric research? No. You can, but you're not expected to. So check out what you can find on the rubric, and then once you've read the rubric, let us know what questions are. I haven't looked at the rubric since I wrote it 5, 6, 8, 10 weeks ago, so I'm not prepared to talk about it. I have an unrelated question. How many people are in Eckengreen's Econ 191 that meets tonight? I just need to know. Am I seeing anybody else again tonight? Okay, cool. Good. No overlap. I'm doing that tonight, so I didn't know if there was any overlap between that class and this class. None. Okay, cool. No problem. All right. No questions? Ready to rumble? Here we go. Housing starts. So housing starts hit their peak actually in 1925. Is that right? Yes, 1925. These, now remember, I'm still running off the tables from last week, so the new tables you got don't kick in until about halfway through today's lecture. We're still working off the tables from last week, which we're down here as well. So housing starts, you can see in table 4 down here at the bottom right, they peak in 1925 and then begin their decline. There's some parallels there to what happened currently leading into the 2007 recession. Housing starts peak again in the most current period. Housing starts peaked before 2007. You can see also the dramatic decline in housing starts. So from a high of 750,000 or more. Why are these numbers look different than those numbers? Oh, I know why. The chart on the left is urban, and the thing on the right is both urban and rural. Because the numbers, the table and the chart are slightly different, because this peak is at 9 something and this peak is at 750 something. So this is urban, and this is both urban and rural. What are housing starts? When they begin building a house, they have to take. Who asked the question? When they begin building a house, so it's different than the permit, so you have to take out the permitting process a little bit before. So it's when you actually like break ground or buy the first piece of wood, so it's the beginning of construction. Yeah. Dramatic decline, and if I were to show you, which I'm not prepared to do because I didn't think of it until just a second, the graph for right now, you'd see a similar dramatic decline. But this decline for the total urban plus rural around 900,000 per year down to about 100,000 per year. If I showed you the chart, which you've seen in my other classes if you've had Econ 1 from me, if I showed you the chart for housing starts from 2000 or 1980 to today, it looks very similar to this, with a very sharp rise and an astounding decrease. One difference between today and the 1930s is today this line comes down and then bounces along the bottom for about 4 or 5 years. So this one it hit bottom and then turns around and goes back up. Peter. 1920s, yeah, so in terms of mortgages, it was relatively easy to get a mortgage in 1920. One of the things about the 1920 mortgages that distinguishes it from the current period is the practice of getting a mortgage in which every payment went a little bit towards interest, a lot towards interest, and a little bit towards the principal that you borrowed, so that's called amortizing the loan. That's a New Deal phenomenon. So a lot of the loans that people had in the 1920s were what we call balloon payments or interest-only loans. So they would pay interest only on the mortgage, and then at the end of a 3 or a 5 year cycle, or sometimes 10, they would owe the full amount of principal. And the pattern was typically that then you would go in and refinance. So the bank would give you a loan in 1922 for $5,000. It would be due in 1925. You still owe the $5,000 in 1925. You go down to the bank in 1925. They would say, oh, this is peachy because your house is now worth $7,000. So yes, we'll reloan you the $5,000. The problem becomes, which is later in this story, but the problem becomes that when housing prices decline, when you're going down to the bank and saying, can I refinance this loan, and your house used to be worth $6,000 and they were willing to write a $5,000 loan against that, if the housing price falls to say $4,000, they're no longer willing to write a $5,000 loan against it. And so you had, similarly to today, you had a lot of people who wound up what we say is upside down today, so people who owed more than their house was worth. Yeah. Now, one of the reasons that housing peaks in this period, in the 1920s and 1930s, is those immigration restrictions that we talked about last week when Professor Sutch was here. So remember the 1921 and 1924 immigration restrictions, and the many charts that he showed you, and I know he showed you like 376 charts, but there was one that showed you that pattern of immigration over time and how it goes way up, and then it basically collapses, particularly after the 1924 immigration quota. So the restriction on the ability of people to migrate into the United States vastly decreases the new household formation rate. So how many new households are there in any given year? That's a big decrease in the demand for housing. So combined with some bubbles that had been created through overbuilding, because I never know whether I'm talking about the 20s or the aughts, combined with some bubbles that had been created through overbuilding in some areas, that big decrease in the demand for housing is part of what leads to the peak and then the collapse of the housing market. Okay, next picture. What's happening overall in terms of GNP? Overall in terms of GNP, this is table, I got my glasses on to see what it says, table 8, good, my table blob from here. Components of GNP, GDP in this period are essentially the same for the United States. Remember the difference between GNP and GDP comes when you have an economy that has a lot of multinationals that are operating in that economy. So in that case, there's going to be a difference between GNP, which is based on the ownership of the resources, and GDP, which is based on the domicile or the location of the resources. For the United States in this period, the differences between GNP and GDP are so tiny, I don't even know what they are, and we don't have to worry about it. So looking at total output GNP, breaking it out into consumption, investment, exports, and government, and then breaking investment down further into inventory investment, so swings in the amount of goods that are held in inventory, and fixed investment, that's the machines and the buildings. This table shows you how much of the drop in GNP in the Great Depression and in the recession before 1920-21 and the recession after 37-38, how much of the drop in output was due to each of the components of aggregate demand. So when we look at the 1920-21 recession, very sharp, unemployment goes up. It's only a 13-month recession. Unemployment rises over 10%, but this thing is a real quick, sharp, painful, but very fast adjusting recession. And primarily what's going on in 1921 is it's an inventory cycle. So that positive number of 256 means that the swing in inventories more than explains the total drop in GDP. That if the only thing that had changed was inventories, the change in GDP would have been 2.56 times as large as it was. But the negative sign here in front of consumption tells us that consumption actually was rising during this period. So consumption was offsetting the decreases in inventories, the decrease in inventory investment, which was pushing the economy down. So the typical story about 1920-21, businesses had built up a lot of inventories at the close of World War I, anticipating that prices would rise. Prices didn't rise to the same extent that businesses thought they would. Businesses sold off those inventories, so they decreased their production to sell off the inventories because the bet that they had made on price swings turned out to be a bad bet. So they lay off all of their workers, they sell goods out of inventory. Once they've sold off the goods out of inventory, they rehire the workers and start producing again. So it was basically, oops, we screwed up, we built up too many inventories, we've got to sell out of inventory, we're going to lay all off until we sell off our inventories. So that's 1920-21. Consumption doesn't decline. If a decline in consumption had been part of the decline in the economy in the 1920s, there would be a positive, not a negative sign in front of the consumption component. Fixed investment, that's the machines and buildings, that's contributing about 50%. Government, like consumption, is a countervailing balance, so purchases are expanding. So that's making the recession less bad in 2021 than it would have been if government purchases had not expanded. Contrast that with what happens 1930 to 1933. 1930 to 1933, the first thing is that consumption spending is contributing to the downturn. That means that consumption spending is falling as the rest of the economy is falling. I don't remember if I've shown you the graph, or if I have, if I pointed it out. One of the things that was unique about 2007, 2009 is it was the first downturn since the Great Depression when real consumption spending fell. So in the Great Depression, the drop in income was so large, or there are other explanations we'll get to, that consumption spending fell. In 2007, 2009, consumption spending fell. In all the other intervening recessions, consumption continued to rise, although more slowly, but it still continued to rise throughout the downturn. So the drop in consumption contributes to the downturn in 29 to 30. 29 to 32, inventories are not doing much in terms of explaining why the economy is going down. So this is, 256% of the downturn is explained by inventories in 2021. 3, 4, 20, nothing. The drop in investment is also a part of the story in 29 to 33, so that part of the explanation, or where we want to look for stories about why the economy declined, is going to come from investment spending. Net exports, teeny tiny. So there is a drop in net exports. So net exports and GDP are moving in the same direction. That's why there's positive signs in front of all those numbers. So it's not countervailing, it's going in the same direction. But those are tiny, less than 10%. Very, very small part of the downturn is due to swings in net exports. And then in the first 2 years of the downturn, government purchases are actually making the downturn less bad than it would have been if they had done nothing. So government purchases are going up, which helps to offset the problems in the Great Depression. And then in the second part, 32 to 33, the government purchases are contracting, but it's still teeny tiny. So when we look at 29 to 33, the components of aggregate demand that really need to be the components of aggregate demand that we need to focus on to understand what's going on in the Great Depression are really consumption and fixed investment, that is machines and buildings. So inventories are not the story, net exports is not the story, government is not the story is consumption and investment. Peter?
So net exports
yeah. Yes. Yeah. So when you get people who say, oh, it was all Smoot-Hawley, it was the protective tariffs in the 1930s, and that's why we went through depression. Exactly. For the United States, you point to those numbers and you say, not a whole lot of the story, thank you very much. End of, yeah, that's a little more articulate than, but yes. And then contrast it again with what happens 1937-38, so that's the double dip. In the double dip, the second dip, what do we have? We've got, again, a big inventory swing. Net exports and government purchases are countervailing pressure, so they're keeping the downturn from being worse than it actually was. And declines in investment spending are a big part of the story in 37-38. All right, so let's talk about consumption. One of the things about the 1920s is the consumer durables revolution. When I started graduate school, when I got to my third year of graduate school, I decided that being a straight-up macroeconomist was not for me because the professors in the macro field were incredibly sexist, and I wasn't going to put up with that kind of crap. And also because I really wanted to talk about issues of unemployment, and I was in graduate school 1978 to 1984, which is we had the first OPEC crisis 73-75, we had the second one 79-80, and by about 1980, macroeconomists throw up their hands and say, we haven't got a clue what's going on, we don't know how to explain unemployment and inflation, so let's just assume the economy is always at full employment. Okay. I guess that makes it easier to explain unemployment. It doesn't exist. So I wound up doing economic history and was particularly interested in the Great Depression. And what my advisor and others said was, if you really want to understand the Great Depression, you're going to have to figure out the 20s. But if you start in 1929, you're never going to understand the Great Depression. You've got to start earlier. You've got to look at the 1920s to understand what's going on in the Great Depression. So one of the things that I worked on was this consumer durables revolution. The book that's referenced in the other article, Buy Now Pay Later, is the work that came out of my dissertation. And the consumer durables revolution is the shorthand for saying there was a shift, not a movement along, but a shift in the demand for durable goods starting in the 1920s. So if you just think, standard sorts of, let's draw a picture here and put, say, consumption on the vertical axis and disposable income on the horizontal axis. And yeah, sure, if there's an increase in disposable income, there's going to be an increase in consumption. I'll call that line C1. But what we get is that in the 1920s, this entire line shifts up. So there is an increase, a shift in the demand for durable goods in particular. So you don't see it for non-durables, food and clothing, but you see it for durable goods. So household appliances, furniture, pianos, phonographs, all those things that are studied in the When Your Word Is Not Enough article. The consumer durables revolution comes about, I argue, for two reasons. One is the increase in advertising, and so there was the shift I described before in terms of the content of advertising and a big push in terms of the volume of advertising, putting these goods in front of the public and convincing folks that these durable goods were things that they needed to complete their family. Fascinating work that's been done by a whole bunch of people on the rise of advertising. And the second piece, which becomes important in terms of understanding the 1930s, is the increase in installment credit. That the consumer durables revolution, that increase by families in their purchases of durable goods, is facilitated by their ability to use credit in order to buy these things. So we talked about installment credit last week when we did the When Your Word Is Not Enough paper. The key parts to this installment credit are that the installment credit is tied to a particular good. So if you're going to buy a piano, you get an installment loan for buying that piano. And if you miss payments, or otherwise breach your contract, and I'll come back to that later. If you miss payments or otherwise breach your contract, the sales finance company, so the company like GMAC that wrote that installment contract, has the legal right to repossess the good that you're purchasing. That's still true. All of that is still true. What's unique in the 1920s is that the down payments are substantially large. They're typically about 1/3 of the total. The terms of these payments, the length that is of these contracts, typically about 12 months, sometimes 18 or 24, but typically 12 months. So you get 1/3 down, 12-month contracts. And that means that in contrast to today, when you drive the car off the lot in 1926, you have a car that's worth more than what you still owe on the contract. Today, when you buy a car, you put 0% down, you get a 5 or a 7-year loan, you drive that car off the lot, and the car is now worth less than what you owe on the car. Right? So you have payments and you owe a whole bunch of money on the car, and the car, if you sold the car, you couldn't even get enough money back to pay off the loan. The flip is true in the 1920s. So people are accumulating wealth, they're accumulating equity in these durable goods, even as they're buying them on time. So they buy an $800 car, they finance, I can't buy $800, they buy a $900 car, they buy a $900 car, they come up with $300 for a down payment, they finance the other $600. The car doesn't lose 1/3 of its value when you drive it off the lot. It loses like 5 to 10% of its value when you drive it off the lot. And so they have equity, they have wealth in the durable good, which means that if they screw it up and they don't make their payments and that thing is repossessed, when the car is repossessed, they do cancel the debt. So you no longer owe the debt, but they've taken the car away as well. And if the car is worth more than the debt, that repossession means the family's losing wealth. So if the car is worth $850 and you only owe $600 on the installment contract, they're going to repossess the car when you stop making your payments. They're not giving you back that $250 difference. They're going to pocket that $250 difference. And so there's a big incentive in terms of wealth accumulation to make sure you make the payments, because if they repossess that car, you're going to be out. You're going to be literally out some cash. It's not like that you have a loan that's worth more than the car. These days, they repossess your car after 6 months, and you're thinking, that's cool. My brother-in-law did this. My brother-in-law figured he'd had his car for a couple of years. He smashed it up a little bit. He still owed a lot of money on the loan, and so he just stopped making the payments on the loan and figured they would come and repossess the car. And he didn't care because he owed like $14,000 on the loan, and the car he figured was worth about $4,000, and he figured the joke was on the repo man. Totally opposite case in the 1920s, right? The joke was always on the buyer, that the buyer typically had more value in that car than they owed on the contract. The debt-to-income ratio doubles in the 1920s. So some pictures. This one runs from 1919 to 1939. What color are these lines? The lower line shows you the dollar value of installment contracts. The blue line shows you the debt-to-income ratio. So that's much more interesting, taking the total amount of consumer debt, this is non-mortgage debt, and dividing it by the amount of income. And that ratio, which is measured on the right-hand axis, that ratio is doubling between 1920 and 1930. So there's a doubling in just a decade of the amount of consumer debt in the economy. To put that into a longer-term context, this shows you from 1919 through today, the debt-to-income ratio. And so here's that first decade where we get that doubling of the debt-to-income ratio, and it gets up to about 9%. So double it again gets us to 18%. So the next doubling doesn't happen until the mid-1990s. So it doubles to 9% in the 1920s in just one decade, and then it takes 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 65 years for that debt-to-income ratio to double again. Right? So huge, fast increase in installment debt. How does that compare with residential mortgage debt? This picture was non-mortgage debt. How does that compare with mortgage debt? Here's mortgage debt, and the lines are showing you here 1919, 1929, give or take. Oh yeah, because I had to work to figure out which years were which. 1939. And so you can see here also that there's this big increase in mortgage debt in the 1920s. All right, consumption spending in 1930. The interesting thing about consumer spending in 1930 is that consumer spending between 1929 and 1930 drops in nearly all categories. So Stan Liebergott did work. Now pass on. Stan Liebergott did work on to take the numbers that we had on consumer spending and push them back a little ways. And using work that he did and work that the Bureau of Economic Analysis did, you can look at, as you break down that C of C++ plus G plus net exports into its various components, was it just a couple of places in consumer spending that declined? And the answer is no. It's a relevant question because one of the things that consumers are paying for that's captured here in personal business is the fees they pay to stockbrokers. So even though a relatively small share of the population was involved in the stock market in the 1920s, estimates vary from 5 to 20% of the population was involved in the stock market. So it's a relatively small share of the population that's in the stock market. They were undertaking large numbers of transactions. The last graph that I showed you on Thursday. Today's Tuesday? Or today Thursday? I have no idea. Today's Tuesday. I had to do one of those little scratch-off hang tags today on my car to park. I didn't know what day of the week it was. I knew so I'm hoping I'll get a ticket. I'll scratch off 3 different dates because I have no idea. I'm teaching today, that's all I know. Important things. Anyway, if you look at the amount that people paid to their stockbrokers for those various purchases and sales of stocks, that's captured here in the personal business category. And so it's interesting to see whether or not the collapse of consumption in 1929 and 1930 is simply because people stopped buying stocks, and it's not. That decrease in consumption spending is across the board. It's in virtually every category of consumption spending, with 2 exceptions down here at the bottom: education and research and religion and welfare. This is the one time that it's relevant to keep in mind that consumption spending is not simply spending by households, but it's spending by households and nonprofit organizations. So consumption spending is spending by households and nonprofits. So they lump nonprofits, who are presumably not motivated by